Hey guys, it's Courtney and welcome back. Today I'm going to be using the Oopsie Daisy stamp set by Scrappy Tails Crafts, and we're going to be doing a little bit of Copic coloring both on my traditional Nina Solar White cardstock as well as, well, it's not Kraft cardstock, it's Desert Storm cardstock, also by Nina. So I'm going to start off by stamping out one of the images from the stamp set with some blackout ink by Ink on 3 onto both the Desert Storm cardstock as well as the white cardstock. I'm using the Ink on 3 blackout ink because it is Copic safe. We're obviously going to be doing some Copic coloring on both of these pages just to kind of see the difference in your coloring when your paper's not white. So I'm going to start off with my Nina Solar White. Sorry, drew a blank. But I'm going to go ahead and color this kind of my traditional way. So I'm going to start off with my lightest color, kind of map out my darkest areas, get the paper saturated a little bit so that my colors blend a little bit easier. Then I'm going to go in with my darkest color and just add the very, very deepest shadow. So basically, this particular image shows you exactly where the shadow should be. There's a lot of detail within these images and it makes it super easy to color. I'm also going to add a little bit of a shadow where this petal is kind of behind another. Then I'm going to blend those areas out with my two midtones and finish back off with my lightest color. And you can see that I get pretty good contrast there. I'm going to go ahead and color another petal on camera just so that you can kind of see more than just one. And I'm going to do this the same exact way, starting out with my lightest color first to get the paper saturated a little bit. And that way, if I make a mistake, it's very easy to color or cover the lightest color rather than going right in with my darkest color. Sometimes, depending on the colors that I use or the area that I'm coloring, I may go in with my darkest first just to prevent any bleeding outside of the lines. So I'm going to color this one the same way. This one has a little bit deeper of a shadow where it's hanging behind that other petal, but it is pretty much the same. I went ahead and finished up coloring all of the petals for this flower the same exact way as I did the first two. And then we are going to move on to the Desert Storm cardstock. And I'm just going to start with one petal here, like I did with the first one, but I'm going to use the same four colors that I used for the first one on the Solar White cardstock, just to kind of show you the difference. So you can see when I go in with my lightest color, you can barely see it. Now the paper is saturated, and the thing I like about this particular cardstock is it is nice and smooth, and it does take Copic or alcohol markers very well, but it has some color to it. So when you're going in with your lightest colors or even your darkest colors, it's going to be toned down a lot. So you're not necessarily going to get the same contrast as you would on the white paper, as you can see here. So one of the ways to fix that is to just go a little bit darker. So I'm going to bring in an E15 and I'm going to go over those shadow areas again. Now I'm just using the tip of my marker. You can see that my marker is straight up and down, and that's how you add just a tiny bit of that color, keeping that marker straight up and down and just barely touching the paper. But I'm going to go ahead and use the other four colors that I used before and just gradually blend that out, leaving pretty much the center of the petal for my highlight color, which is almost the same color as the paper itself. But you can see once I add that really deep shadow, you get that contrast back again. So I went ahead and finished up all of the petals for this flower, and you can see that it is, even though it's on paper that's not white, it looks very similar to the first one, even though we use that very scary dark color. Now I'm going to pretty much do the same thing for the center of the flower. Like I said before, these images are very detailed. Those little flick lines will show you exactly where your shadows need to be. So I'm going to go around the outside of the center of the flower, and that's going to be my darkest area, because typically, if you ever look at the center of a flower like this, it's kind of raised up in the center. So that's going to be the lightest color because it's closest to us. The parts that are furthest away from us are going to be a little bit darker. So it would be the outside of the inside of the flower, if that makes any sense. But I am using three colors here. And then when I move on to my flower on the Desert Storm cardstock, I am going to again start off with that lightest color to get the paper saturated, but this time I'm going to bring in an even darker color, and I'm going to bring in the E59. Now I'm using this pretty sparingly. I'm not adding quite as much as I did with the darkest color for the first one, but you can see once again my marker is straight up and down in order to get those little flick lines and get into those kind of tiny little areas so that I don't add too much ink. Then I'll go back in with the same 3 colors that I used on the Nina Solar White cardstock and just kind of blend that out towards the center. Now the E53 is pretty much identical to the Desert Storm cardstock, but I am still using it because it's going to kind of blend all of these colors together and kind of make them mesh a little bit more. So you can see that there's not really that much of a difference, even though I brought in a really, really dark color for each one of these. Now for the greens, I'm going to do something a little bit different. You'll see that I am going to go in right with my darkest color first. And I'm doing this because, well, this leaf isn't very small, but the other leaves are very small and the stem is very small. So I want to keep it consistent, and I want to make sure that my colors don't bleed. The more ink you add, the more likely it is to bleed. And for tiny images or tiny areas, you have a better chance of it bleeding. So I like to go in right with my darkest color first. Now I am going to use the same colors that I used on the white cardstock on the Kraft cardstock, because this time I am going to bring in some shadowing or some additional shadowing with a colored pencil. I'm using a polychromo here. You don't have to use them. You can use any color pencils that you have in your stash. You just want to make sure that you're not going to add too much pressure. So you'll see when I take my pencil here, I'm going to hold it up away from the tip. And this will allow me to not add too much pressure. I can always go back and add more if I want to, but this way I can have a little bit more control with how much color I am putting down. Just going to add that to my deepest, darkest areas. And I'm going to do the same thing with the stem. I left the stem in here because I shaded this a little bit different than I normally do. I'm adding a little bit of shading to the top and bottom of the stem. And then where it's kind of curved in, I'm adding a little shading there. So it's kind of like it's curved on both sides. So where it's curved in on the left-hand side, I'm adding a shadow. And then when you get towards the bottom, it's curved in on the right side, and I'm adding a little bit of a shadow there and just extending that out, blending that out each and every time as I move down to my lightest color. Once again, I'm going to use the same 4 colors as I used for that first leaf and that I used for the white cardstock, and I'm shading this the exact same way on the Desert Storm cardstock. But again, I'm going to go ahead and bring in my colored pencil to just deepen up these shadows just a little bit to add a little bit more contrast to my image. I went ahead and colored up the other leaves the same way. I added my colored pencil on the Kraft cardstock as well for the smaller leaves. And now I'm going to make these into very simple, very, very simple cards. For this first one here, I am going to stamp one of the sentiments that is from the same stamp set with some VersaFine Onyx Black ink. I'm going to stamp that off to the right-hand side, but I'm going to just overlap the image just a tiny bit. Then I am going to trim this down just by 1/4 inch and then take a piece of black cardstock and cut that just a little bit larger than my card panel, but still just a tad bit smaller than the card base itself. You guys know, if you've watched my channel before, I like to matte things on black and just have a little bit of that black cardstock showing. It really makes your images pop, especially for a very clean and simple card like this. It just kind of helps it stand out a little bit more. So for the second card, I am going to also trim this down by 1/4 inch. And before I stamp my sentiment here, I want to kind of add a little bit of something else rather than just having it kind of plain. Now, when I went to grab my cardstock, I don't know whether you're going to be able to notice, but on my right wrist, there's a huge red spot. My whole shelf collapsed on my hand. I'm okay, but it kind of turned red a little bit, and now, as I'm doing this voiceover, it's pretty bruised. It also broke my ruler, as you can see, but I'm still using it. I'm just using the grid lines on my work surface here to draw a straight line on all 4 sides, and I'm just going to go around the petals on the left-hand side. They kind of stick out a little bit. I'm not drawing directly over them, just kind of framing in my image a little bit. Then I can stamp my sentiment with that same VersaFine Onyx Black ink on the top right-hand corner. Once again, I am going to map this onto some black cardstock with just a little bit of that poking through, and then onto a Nina Desert Storm card base. So it's kind of a tone on tone there with just a little bit of a pop of black. And like I said, for clean and simple cards like that, it really makes everything stand out. So here's the difference. It's really not that much of a difference. It just kind of gives it a little bit of a rustic look, I guess you could say. But I love the way Copic coloring turns out on Desert Storm cardstock. But I hope you give it a try. Thank you guys so much for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.